Hello everyone and welcome back to my Star Citizen channel. Today I want to talk about the interview The State of Star Citizen with Chris Roberts, which was published on February 26. I want to break this video into three parts. First, I will go over what Chris Roberts actually says in the interview. Second, I will look at how the community reacted. And third, I will give you my personal opinion on all of it. I want to start as fairly and objectively as possible before moving into my own take. So first, the objective part. Chris Roberts describes Star Citizen in the interview as his personal, unfinished business. He says that the situation back in 2012 was very different and that the success of crowdfunding caused the project to become much bigger than originally planned. He also says that the internet back then was more hopeful, more optimistic and less cynical than it's today. One of the main points of the interview is his explanation for why Star Citizen has taken so long. Roberts basically says that existing engine could not do what Star Citizen needed. So CIG had to build its own technology to support a seamless, detailed and persistent universe. He also talks about the scale of the end goal, a fully realized universe where very large numbers of players can exist at the same time. A big part of the technical discussion is about server structure and scaling. According to Roberts, current chart counts are around 700 to 800 players, with the goal of going past 1000 this year, reaching around 1000 to 2000 in the medium term, and eventually going far beyond that in long term. If I'm not wrong, he said 10,000 in one chart, or even in an instance. Then he talks about Squadron 42. Chris Roberts says it is in the process of being finished and describes it as an ultimate version of the vision he originally had with Wing Commander. When it comes to Star Citizen 1.0, he points back to the feature set shown at CitizenCon and says the project now feels closer to the finish line than the starting line. So that is the objective core of the interview. A massive vision, massive technology demands and project that grew far beyond original plan. A strong focus on server meshing, Squadron 42 nearing completion and the feeling from Chris that they are finally getting closer to the goal. Now if you look at the community reaction, it is very clearly mixed. The Reddit discussion around the interview shows a combination of excitement, caution, skepticism and fatigue. One part of the community is still very hopeful. These are the people who say there is simply no other game trying to do what Star Citizen is trying to do, and that this dream is exactly why they still believe in the project despite all the problems. Another part of the community is more pragmatic. These players basically say, yes, the game has bugs, server issues and performance problems, but when it works, it feels extremely immersive and can be incredibly fun. Then there is the clearly skeptical group. Their criticism is that after so many years, basic things still do not work reliably, and that more and more features keep being added while the foundation still feels unstable. There is also a group that wants people not to confuse charisma with proof. In the Reddit discussion, some users point out that Chris Roberts comes across as passionate and convincing, but that this alone should not be treated as evidence that everything is on track. So overall, the community is not simply positive or negative, it is a mix of hope, frustration, admiration, doubt and exhaustion all at the same time. And now I want to get into my own opinion. The first thing that stood out to me was Chris Roberts saying that the internet used to be more optimistic and is now much more cynical. I understand where he is coming from, but I only think that statement is half fair, because this skepticism did not come out of nowhere. When a project has been in development for over 12 or 13 years, when there is still no finished product and when people are still dealing with bugs, instability and basic issues, then of course people are going to become more skeptical. So to me, this is not just a community problem, it is also a result of the development itself. In other words, people did not just become cynical for no reason. A lot of them became cynical because of the way this project has unfolded over the years. Then there is this transparency point. Chris presents CIG as a very transparent company, and to be fair, that is true to a certain degree. There are lots of videos, lots of updates, the progress tracker, roadmaps and in general more visibility than many other studios give their communities. But I would still say this transparency is not just some generous gift to the bakers, it also came out of pressure. Over the years, bakers wanted more and more proof what was actually happening at CIG, because so much money had gone into the project while so many major questions stayed unanswered. And honestly, I think bakers have that right. We did not just buy a finished product off a shelf, We funded the vision, and if people are putting money into that vision for years, then I think it is completely fair to expect clear communication about what is working and what is not working and why some things had to be rebuilt multiple times. I'm pointing here to the flight model as an example. Another big point for me is this repeated argument about development time. Chris once again explains that the game started much smaller, then more money came in, then the scope expanded, and naturally that made everything take longer. And yes, that is true. Of course, a bigger and more complex game takes longer. And yes, I would much rather have that than a publisher-driven release where shareholders force an unfinished game out the door. But my problem is this: we have not been hearing this explanation for a few months. We have been hearing versions of this explanation for years. And after 12 or 13 years, I personally need more than just the project got bigger. At this point, I want to hear more about what was misjudged, what lessons were learned, where the team may have lost focus, what priorities may have been wrong, and most importantly, what is actually being done differently now so this story does not just repeat itself again and again. A good example of that for me was the section about planets. Chris talks about how much more complex the planets tech became, how players can now land almost anywhere, and how all of that naturally takes time. And again, I agree with that on a non-technical level. It is impressive. Anyone who has followed Star Citizen for years already knows that. But that is exactly where my issue comes in. This is not a new explanation anymore. It is the same logic in a different form. First, it was one system that needed more time, then another system, then another technology, then another technical breakthrough. At some point, as a baker, you stop wanting to hear only why everything is difficult, and you start asking why there is still no clear endpoint. And then there is his argument that the bigger Star Citizen gets, the more visible it becomes, and the more criticism it attracts. Again, that is not completely wrong. Of course, a larger project gets more attention, but in my view, that only explains a part of it. Star Citizen has been under heavy criticism for years already, not just recently, not just because it became huge, but because people have been asking the same question for a long time. Where is the finished game? Why are basic issues still taking so long? And why are there still so many major problems after all these years and all this money? So to me, it sometimes feels like a part of the criticism gets pushed outward in this interview. The internet is more cynical, the project is more visible, people do not understand the complexity, but I think that is only part of the truth. Because a lot of criticism was also created by CIG itself, by scope expansion, by years of delays, by promises that were too big, and by a development process that often felt like it was getting broader instead of getting clearer. That is why my view is split, to be honest. I absolutely understand why people still find this project fascinating. I'm also still fascinated, and I also understand why Chris Roberts still comes across as passionate and believable to many people. But at the same time, I think passion alone is not enough anymore. What I want today is not more dream language. I want more accountability. Less, this is also massive, and more, this is where we got it wrong. Less, people are cynical, and more, we understand why many bakers became critical after all these years. So if I had to sum up the interview in one sentence, I would put it like this. Chris Roberts is still very good at selling the grand vision of Star Citizen, but that is exactly why we also have to look more carefully than ever at what is real progress and what is just next good sounding explanation. Maybe you have a different opinion than I have, which is totally fine. I would really like to know what you think. Did this interview give you more hope, or did it just confirm the same old question marks for you? Please write it down on the comment section. And until next time.